In the last episode, Yi Sun-sin learned of the destruction of the Navy. At the same time, he was about to be reappointed as the Supreme Naval Commander. Now the Japanese are on the move again. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. It's kind of hard to imagine, but at the beginning of the war, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had told his generals that the Korean civilians were to be treated as well as possible. Why? Well, because he envisioned them joining his armies in the conquest of the Ming. Now, however, he felt very differently. After years and years of resistance, and especially the Korean civilian righteous army attacks, he wanted a new approach taken. Everyone would now be subject to the sword. A decree was sent out to all surrounding regions. The only chance the farmers would have is if they returned to their fields. Those that resisted would be hunted down along with their families. The common people could live only if they obeyed, and those that turned in any officials would be rewarded. Everyone else would be wiped out. As we move forward with this series, please keep this in mind. On September 11th, Hidehide marched his men west from Busan and went as far as the Chola border, and then headed northwest towards the city of Namwon. Meanwhile, Mori Hidemoto would take a more eastern route, as the plan was to meet in the northern Chola province in an almost pincer-like move. From Busan, Engulpo, and Kadok Island, other units would follow. But they would mostly go by way of ship up through the Samjin River, as far as it would take them at least. These forces are the commands of Kunishi Yukinaga, Soyoshi Toshi, Shimizu Yasuhiro, and Hachisuka Iyamasa were now only 10 kilometers from Namwon. In the fields nearby, they took what horses they had and tied them up, as the trip had actually been very stressful for the animals. Now, after a while, a report from a local was received that a force of 20,000 were there at Namwon, with another 20,000 on the way. Konishi and the other commanders decided to hold a quick meeting to discuss what their next move should be. In the end, they decided to attack before the reinforcements could arrive. They broke up camp and marched to the city on September 23rd and joined Yukita Hidei. There was now around 68,000 Japanese soldiers surrounding Namwon. The previous report of 20,000 defenders turned out to be false. In reality, inside the fortress, only 3,000 Ming soldiers led by General Yang Yuan and 700 Korean soldiers under Chola Army Commander Yi Bok-nam. There was also, of course, several civilians. However, the defenses were still quite formidable. Around the fortress itself was a very deep trench, and inside that trench was wooden spikes lining the bottom. The walls were also 4 meters high at the lowest, and tower gates were much higher. And not to be forgotten was the new Korean matchlocks, many cannons, and of course arrows. The goal for the Japanese wasn't just to take this area, but to actually keep losses down. So they would actually need to be quite careful. That same day, on September 23rd, 100 Japanese matchlock Aishiguro spread out in a wide arc and started to fire at the walls. They did this to draw enemy fire so that the Japanese commanders could actually see what the enemy's strength was. Remember, they did not know at this time that there wasn't 20,000 men. On the 24th was the real assault. To get to the walls, they would actually need to fill the trenches first. Even under heavy cannon, matchlock, and arrow fire, several areas were actually filled with straw and dirt. They then stormed in close, taking cover amongst the remains of the Korean houses that General Yang Yuan had burned before the siege. The fighting started to die down the next day on the 25th. The Japanese then shouted that they actually wished to speak to the defenders. Yang Yuan sent a man out to determine what they wanted. But he already felt he knew, And he was right, as the man returned telling him that the Japanese wanted them to surrender. Yang, of course, refused. The attack resumed and continued into the night. Even though there was now a heavy rainstorm in the area, on the Japanese side, the commanders had actually been studying the walls though, and more importantly, where the most soldiers were. Ming soldiers were positioned at the east, west, and south gates, with the Korean forces holding the north. They also knew that their arrows were starting to run low. They were definitely getting tired. The most important thing they determined was that at the lowest ends of the walls was the most troops, and the highest would have the least. And they were actually correct in this assumption. By the way, the highest point was the southern end. In preparation for the assault, the Japanese commanders sent their men into nearby fields to cut down and bundle up rice stalks that were still wet and green. The men inside Namwon saw this, but couldn't figure out why the Japanese were doing this. They would soon figure out though. On September 26, when night had fallen, the Japanese performed a 2-hour barrage of matchlock fire and shot from captured Korean cannons against the walls of Namwon, which forced the men inside the walls to keep their heads down, but also made it to where they actually couldn't hear over these shots. Now, while this happened, the Japanese quickly carried their rice stalk bundles over to the wall and built a ramp all the way to the top. Suddenly, all the matchlocks and cannons stopped firing. When the Ming and Korean soldiers finally got a chance to look over the walls, what they saw horrified them. The ramp was complete, and Japanese were quickly climbing up it, with the samurai Matsuura Shigenobu leading them. The defenders tried to use fire arrows to burn away at the enemy ramp, but it wouldn't burn. The stalks were still green and wet from yesterday's rain. And before they knew it, the defenders started to be overwhelmed by the attackers. The Ming General Yang Yuan, though, wasn't there. Now actually, there's a lot of discrepancies about what actually happened. One says that he fought his way out, barely surviving. The other says that the Japanese actually knew exactly who he was and let him escape in case they would later have to engage with the Ming in, well, diplomacy. I'll let you decide what you believe. Either way, General Yang Yuan would be in Seoul that following week. In Namwon, practically everyone was dead. This included Army Commander Yi Bak-nam and every single civilian that had stayed behind. Remember earlier what I said about Hideyoshi wanting to go things about differently this time? Well, part of that was proof of the dead. So, the noses of the soldiers and civilians were cut off, salted and inspected by the daimyo, then sent to certain checkpoints where they could be shipped back to Japan and inspected by the Taiko Hideyoshi himself. And this is where I will leave you. Overwhelming force brought down at Namwon with incredible brutality. Now, before I let this video go, I want to talk about something kind of serious, and that is this, as you can see on the screen. This is Mimizuka. It is a monument that actually contains an estimated 38,000 noses. Interesting enough, Mimizuka actually means Mound of the Ear, and it's an alteration of the original name. The original monument was called Hanazuka, which meant Mound of the Nose. At some point, the name was changed because it was considered less cruel and less shocking. I'm not sure how, but it was. This monument is actually near Kyoto, and a lot of people actually do not know that it exists. Earlier in this video, I mentioned proof of the dead. Well, this is where some of that proof of the dead ended up. And this is not the only monument in Japan. Trophy taking in a lot of cultures, not just Japanese, was actually quite prevalent. However, because of the trauma that has taken place because of this, there is actually a lot of, there's a lot of advocacy that these noses actually be returned back to Korea. Some have actually already been returned, not from this monument, but from others. where they have been cremated. And this is kind of where I would like to ask you, the audience, because some people actually say that they should be left in Japan, not because these are trophies that are deservedly taken, but more to serve as a testament of time, because sometimes you have to remember the bad so that you do not continue to do so in the future. It goes back to that old and sometimes tired but also true statement, well, saying, and that is those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So I would actually like to ask you, should they be returned to Korea where they can be cremated, or should they stay and these monuments stand up, maybe with a placard to, ease tensions or to serve as a testament so that future generations will not create these same acts? Anyway, please tell me down below. Now don't forget to like this video, and I'll see you next time.